Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I suppose if you talk to anyone who's ever spent hours fishing alone, they'll have one or more stories that don't add up. Not supernatural, perhaps, but unsettling. There's something about being that alone, when the only sounds are your own breathing and the soft slap of water against the boat. Maybe it's the silence that starts to unravel the fringes of the mind, the understanding that you're utterly alone. Or maybe it's something primal, something that lies hidden underneath the surface beyond reason or vocabulary. What happened to me last summer wasn't just creepy. It was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong in a way I can't quite put into words. I've tried to rationalize it away, lack of sleep, stress, some lingering fever of the brain. But no amount of reason gets rid of the shudder inside me at the thought of getting back into deep water. It's like I brought something home with me, or left part of myself behind. Fishing was never about the catch for me. It was about stillness, about silence. My job, like most modern ones, is a storm of noise. Constant deadlines, phones vibrating every few minutes. The cold glow of screens burning into my eyes for hours on end. A few times a year I'd break away. Just a weekend. No friends, no family. Just me, a small boat, and a forgotten lake hidden deep in the woods. My grandfather took me there originally. I must have been 10 or 11. It wasn't on any real map. A location you find not with directions, but with memory. You drive 3 hours out, turn onto an old road lined with telephone poles, then follow dirt trails that appear to twist like veins through the woods. The deeper you go down, the more the world recedes. No indication, no sign, just the hum of insects and the stillness of trees leaning in from every side. The lake never was given a name, not even technically. It was a shadowed mirror that was sunk into black pine, encircled by high and knotted banks and tortured roots. As a child, I dreamed of sea serpents that swirled within. Nowadays, I ask myself whether worse is real. In July, I arrived the night before it would be required. The air stank of dirt and pine sap. I pitched camp at the old spot, home sweet home, a small clearing sloping downward toward the water, and began to construct a fire. Night began to fall, and a quiet comfort from the woods settled around me, as though the woods themselves relaxed easier with me around. I ate plain, sat by the fire occasionally, then got into my tent and slept well to the lull of water lapping the beach. The following morning I awoke to a thin veil of mist covering the lake like gauze. It was still. I assembled my gear, hauled my aluminum boat down to the shallows and shoved off. There is something sacred in that instant. The first stroke of the oars, the manner in which the lake receives you without criticism. I drifted to the center where the water grew deep and smooth, like ink in a bowl. For the first hour, everything was fine. I caught and released 2 bass, barely looking at the time, but somewhere around noon, the wind changed. A light breath at first, then a steady whisper that made waves on the surface of the lake. That's when I noticed it. Across the water, in the thinning mist, another boat. It just sat maybe 30 or 40 feet away, still, not floating, not spinning, just parked on the empty lake, where no one was meant to be. It was small and wooden, the sort that looked like it had been handmade and left behind by time. There was no motor, no paddle trailing behind it in the water. I leaned forward, looking. There was nobody in it. I waited. Maybe someone had dropped it and walked onto shore. But the woods were still. Nothing moved. No cries. No ripples. I yelled just loud enough to carry, "Wait, hey there." But the lake absorbed the sound. It didn't ring, it didn't echo off the water. It was as if I hadn't even opened my mouth. That's when I felt it, the presence of being watched. Not by a human in the boat, but from under. The water had thickened all of a sudden, heavy, lively. My stomach turned and I turned my boat slowly, not even looking back. I tried to reassure myself it was an illusion, a submerged log half hidden, a caffeine withdrawal fever dream brought on by isolation. But even when I made it to the shore and was standing on solid earth, my knees were shaking. I made a bigger than usual fire and sat close to it. The woods felt off. The noises were there, but too disconnected. Crickets were making isolated bursts of chirping. The owl hooting came in random intervals. The woods felt like they were performing as if they were themselves. I slept with the fire still burning. I didn't want total darkness. Later, around midnight, I woke up. At first, I had no idea what was wrong. Then I knew. Silence. Not quiet. Silence. The physical kind, pressing in from all sides. No bugs, no wind, no water. Just emptiness. I sat up, already racing heart. Then I heard it. A solitary splash. Then another. The distinct sound of a paddle dipping into water. Slow, deliberate. Coming closer. I unzipped the tent and climbed out, barefoot, racing heart. The moon was full and its long, glassy light lit up the water. There it was. The boat. Closer now. Perhaps 10 feet offshore. Still nobody inside. Only a black shape floating, gently bobbing, but not moving. It had come to a halt again, as if it had made up its mind to. I remained there for what felt like hours. No movement, no wind, just that boat, staring at me. I don't remember going back to the tent, but I did. I zipped it up and sat on the wall, flashlight in my hand, the beam shaking in my palm. I didn't sleep. At dawn, the boat was missing. No sign, no ripple, no noise. I should have left, but I didn't. Death Crown by George R.R. Martin. There was a stubborn element of me that would not submit to fear. I repeated to myself that I was tired, that loneliness deceives the mind. I braced myself back outside. It was different. The water remained the same, but the atmosphere was not. The lake did not welcome me. I felt like I intruded. The trees leaned in closer. The air was dense and tasted metallic. I rowed slowly, my eyes scanning the surface. Nothing moved beneath me. But then, after a little over an hour, I saw it. A shape, down below. Too big to be a fish, too solid to be a shadow. It moved with purpose, circling. I leaned further out over the edge. That's when I saw the face. Pale. Looking up, eyes wide, mouth open in a perfect O, as if screaming. But no bubbles, no ripple. Only a slack, frozen face 20 feet below. Then it was gone. I leaned back so hard the boat rocked. My breathing was jagged. I held onto the oars and pulled hard, not bothering to look back. The lake seemed to repel me as if it would retain me. The oars felt heavier with every stroke. I didn't build a fire that night. I huddled in the tent, every nerve strung tight. I didn't sleep. And then, just after midnight, it returned. Paddle, water, closer, closer. But I didn't go out. I waited by the zipper of my tent, praying with all my might that it wouldn't move. It didn't, but I could hear it, right outside, not splashing anymore, dripping, something wet, breathing. I do not remember morning. I remember running, packing equipment into my trunk, tightening the boat onto the roof with a perfunctory knot and racing down the path like the devil was at my heels. I did not stop for hours, did not talk to anyone for days. I have not returned. I never will. But sometimes late at night, hours after the world has fallen silent, I hear it. A soft splash, and then another. The slicing sound of a paddle through water. Always far away, always close. I like to fish. Now I can't even look at water without shivering, because that lake was not empty, and it did not want me to leave. I vowed it would pass. That time would temper the memory, reduce the fear to its proper perspective, something to chuckle at years later over a beer with old friends. But the opposite happened. The feeling lingered. It began quietly. I'd be flossing my teeth and the stream of water would twist into something else, like a distant oar dipping in rhythm. I'd pass by a pond in the park and feel my throat tighten, as if cold pressure wrapped around my trachea. At night, I'd have the same dark lake and that wooden boat in my dreams, floating silently towards me regardless of how far I'd try to get away. I tried therapy. My therapist was kind, competent. She explained to me that I suffered from post-traumatic stress due to environmental isolation. She told me to confront the fear, to journal it out, to return to water again incrementally. Exposure, she explained, was the only cure, so I did. I started with my bathtub, half full, door ajar, lights on. But even so, I was unable to look directly at the surface. Something in the reflection twisted slightly, as if it wasn't my own face staring back. Next, I walked to a nearby reservoir. It was sunny, popular. Families were laughing on the shore. Children screamed happily into the shallows. It should have been safe. But when I stood on the edge of the water, I saw something. Far out, beyond the buoys. Something small and wood. Drifting. Tranquil. Just like before. I blinked, and it was gone. Lost, like a mirage. I said nothing. I stopped going to therapy. The dreams returned, more vivid than before. And one night, I awoke to the sound that didn't belong. Dripping. In my apartment. I live on the 6th floor. Pounding heart, I eased out of bed and followed it. Down the hallway, past the bathroom to the living room. The window was open. I never leave it open. A gentle breeze slipped inside, cold and wet, and smelling of lake water and moss. Under the sill, a small puddle of water had formed, with wet footprints leading to my bedroom. My fingers shaking, I followed them, step by step. Each print black and heavy, as if something had crept out of the darkness and padded barefoot down my floor. They ended on either side of my bed, but there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. I was awake all night in the kitchen, every light on, knife in my hand. But even daylight didn't bring peace, because on that morning, I saw something I can never forget, scratched on the back of my bedroom window just above the mist on the glass. Stay. Just that. One word. Etched deep, like fingernails on a surface too long underwater. I moved 2 days later, loaded up everything, left the city, rented a new apartment away from any bodies of water. Thought I could escape it. That distance could shatter whatever fragile, invisible thread connected me to that damned lake. But you can't escape something that won't catch you. It waits. It watches. And when the silence is just so, when all the noise of the modern world fades away, you can hear it again. Paddle, water, closer. It happened again last week. It was raining. I was in my office editing a file when the lights flashed. Once, not quite enough to be really noticeable. Then the whine of my screen warped, like static on an old vinyl record. And then I heard it, crystal clear again. A splash, then another. I crept to the window. There was no lake, roofs only. But somehow, the sound didn't come from outside. It came from inside, from the corridor. I got up slowly, every part of me tensed with fear. I crept to the door, opened it. The corridor was dry, quiet, but on the floor, water, slowly pooling, spreading away towards the stairs. I didn't follow it. I closed the door, locked it, and turned around, and found my apartment flooded. The kitchen floor was slick. My bedroom sheets were wet. The ceiling dripped steadily, although there was no leak. My boots squelched when I moved. And in the center of the living room, gingerly balanced on the carpet, a fish, dead, small, silver, eyes wide open, still bleeding. I stood staring at it for a long time, then got rid of it. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left since. I haven't opened the door, and the water hasn't stopped rising. It started at my feet, dripping up through the floorboards, then to my ankles. Now it pools at my knees, cold and black, regardless of how many towels I put down, regardless of how many times I try to clean it up. It just keeps coming. The lights no longer work. My phone is dead. The The sky outside remains constant, always cloudy, always filled with rain. And just now, I heard it again. Not outside, from below. A knock, from beneath the floor. Once, twice, then the soft creak of oars. And I know without a glance that if I open the window, it'll be there. That same boat, closer now, empty, waiting. Perhaps it has always been waiting for me to stop running, for me to be tired enough, desperate enough, to get inside. I think I will. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Because this isn't a haunting, it's a call. And I was never meant to leave that lake, I just didn't know it until now. So if someone does find this, if you ever find yourself drawn to a still lake in the middle of nowhere, turn around. Leave. Don't tarry. Because once you hear the oars, it's already too late. There is something about the rain that changes the world imperceptibly. Not that sort of rain that yells or bawls. No thunderstorm booming, no screeching winds, no flashing lightning. Rather, the gentle, steady drizzle, the sort that blunts corners and mutes noise. On a night such as this, the world retires, mute in a fashion approaching unnaturalness. The air becomes thick, and the usual distractions fade, leaving the rhythm of incessant rain beating on glass, the dripping water accumulating on pavement. It was during one of those stormy nights quite a few months ago that I found myself completely by myself in some brand new minuscule apartment, somewhere which was meant to be safe. Yet as the evening hours drew out, something started making a slow creep just below the skin of usualness, crawling into the hush of the room. The flat itself was plain, nothing exceptional as it happened. A couple of shabby pieces of furniture, the aroma of old dusty books hanging in the air, and the soft whine of the heater fighting against the night's cold. Before the window, the rain poured down relentlessly, pounding against the glass with a relentless hypnotic beat. It was the sort of night to sleep, to close the world out, and slide softly into sleep. I recall sitting in the window that night, teacup in hand, observing the rivulets of water flow across the glass. On the street below, the road was all but deserted, individuals merging with the sheet of rain. From time to time, there'd be the movement of a slow-moving vehicle, tires slipping over wet pavement, that's all. The rain, and beyond that, the far, wet world. Still, lovely. At least, or so I remember. With the blackness came something else, an eerie lack. Not of noise precisely, but of existence. The nighttime noises I was accustomed to were missing. No howl of a distant dog, no late-night radio hum, no tread of a footstep on the pavement. Even the usual creak of wind through leaves was absent, as if the rain had consumed all in its path, leaving a stillness that cut off hard. I was used to this quietness, to the soothing regular beat of rain. But soon enough it started sounding, not like it itself anymore. Swollen, like some pressure just at the back of my eyes. A stillness so choked it seemed to swallow up everything. The darkness stayed, and I couldn't get rid of the crawling sense of unease. I knew it was just loneliness, that I was dwelling on the stillness too much, that my mind was creating phantasms in the dark. But I knew in my own head something was amiss. It was close to the hour that the clock struck midnight, though I wasn't aware of that until later, when I first heard the first of the unusual sounds. Not loud, not sudden, but a slight scrape or scuffle sound that seemed to come from the apartment next to mine. The flat was tiny, the walls thin. I reassured myself that it must have been the heater settling or perhaps the rain shifting on the siding outside. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then the sound returned, a gentle scraping noise. Lighter this time, but purposeful, like something was being dragged slowly along the floor. I halted my tea, listening intently, my heart pounding in a way I had not expected. The rain continued to pound steadily, but beneath it, the dragging sound continued. It was slow, deliberate, measured, a deliberate, intentional movement in the quiet. I reassured myself that it was rubbish, that the flat was old, that old houses creak and groan. But the sensation of being watched began, a crawling at the base of my neck, as though unseen eyes were looking in on me through the blackness. I did what I believe anyone would have done. I stood up and investigated the room beside my own. Empty. No trace of anyone or anything that might have made the noise. Just the usual mess of opened packages and my own belongings tossed haphazardly over a chair. The squealing had ceased completely, once more made way for the rain. I walked back to my window seat, heart racing. It was all in my mind, I assumed. But the silence had become thick and heavy, with the rain itself and silence joining together to trap me in the apartment. Time was unmeasurable. Hours were minutes, the steady drum of rain creating a distorted sense of timelessness. I wanted to sleep, but sleep was not possible. That was when the other noise began. Not next door, not in the next room, but underneath the floorboards. A light tapping, irregular, as if a rhythm but too quiet to discern. I placed my ear against the wooden floor. The knocking again, faint but resolute. My head worked at explanations. A pipe, a loose plank, a mouse perhaps. But the knock was not anything mechanical or beastly. It was too precise, too deliberate. The more I listened, the more it seemed like a message. A slinking Morse code being tapped into by something just out of vision beneath my feet, struggling to be heard. I didn't know why, but I felt the urge to be completely motionless, not to change position, to listen. The tapping continued for what was an eternity before, finally, it stopped into silence. But that silence that followed was not a quiet one. It was hollow, as if the apartment itself was frozen and held breath. I recall standing at the window, rain blurring the world into smudged smears of black and gray. The street lamp outside flashed once, casting light briefly across the sidewalk before dropping everything back into darkness. And in that brief look, I caught a glimpse of a figure across the way, tall, motionless, barely visible in the rain. For a moment, I believed that the figure was staring at me. I blinked, and the figure disappeared. I tried to tell myself that it was an optical illusion of light or in my head, but the uneasiness did not go away. The feeling of being observed had intensified, a silent dread spreading like a boulder in my belly. The night continued on, the rain drumming on endlessly, washing over the world, but not the night. I attempted to concentrate on ordinary things, my breath, the soft whir of the heater, the soft glow of the screen on my phone. But the apartment itself seemed to breathe in a manner I had not previously experienced. Every shadow shifted, every groan was exaggerated. The tapping again, softer this time with scratching. A noise beyond understanding, something you become aware of on the verge of sleep, something you only grasp when most open. It was enough to root me out entirely. I went to bed, drawing the bedclothes over me, attempting to shut out the noises, the darkness, the choking stillness. But the rain did not let up. The tapping and scratching never really stopped. They hung at the edges of hearing, just past the edge of sleep. Morning arrived with a slow creeping. The rain had finally passed on, leaving the world wet and newly scrubbed clean. But the weight of the night lingered. A residue of fear, a memory that clings even in wide sunlight. I never received an explanation for the sounds or the man in the rain. I thought about relocating, but to vacate the apartment seemed to be admitting defeat to whatever lurked there. Instead, I adapted to living with the stillness, the unsettling quiet that the rain brought. And occasionally, when the world has been rinsed pure and the rain tickles against the glass, I recall that evening. The evening when quiet had been more cacophonous than any cry. The evening when something watched me out of darkness. Over the following days after that rainy night, I was keenly aware of every single sound in the apartment. The groans and creaks of settling wood, the hum of traffic in the distance, even the sound of leaves rustling outside. All were filled with a new depth of meaning, as if repeating reminders of what had occurred. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd dreamed it all. Perhaps the rain, the isolation, the stillness had simply unraveled my mind. But the feeling of being watched did not pass. It clung to me like a second skin, insidious and creeping. At times it seemed to wrap itself around me, even in the light and noise of the apartment. A look down the hallway, a flutter of movement at the edge of my field of vision. But when I turned, there was nothing. Only the familiar walls, the fragments of furniture that I had positioned, the unadorned room that I had made my own. It made it worse in a manner of speaking. The lack of anything material made the experience all the more ethereal, an existence not felt by the touch, but by something more profound, buried in the still crannies of the mind. Something invisible, beyond grasping. I attempted to force myself to release, to consider it a strange night, an anomaly. But with every rainstorm, the same weight returned, compressing the air, wetting the world so the silence itself became a living thing. One evening, a week or so on, the rain started again, slowly at first, then at regular intervals, deluging the city in its soft, relentless melody. I sat again by the window, tea left untouched and now cold on the side table beside me, as the raindrops carved out new paths along the pane. I sensed the familiar chill of nervousness creeping back in, but I reminded myself to stay calm, to watch, to not allow fear to take root. The rain grew heavier, and the apartment felt more quiet. No rumble of cars, no distant noise, nothing but rain pounding against glass and my own breathing. The silence was absolute, total. And then, from underneath the floor below, the banging started again. At first I barely could see it. It was slow, deliberate taps, one by one, spaced a la, trying to write something in a code that I did not recognize. I placed my hand upon the floor, sensing the tiny vibrations along a palm of my hand. It was cold and yet somehow irresistible, like some mystery calling me deeper into the night. This time, though, the tapping had been preceded by another sound, a faint sigh. Not a human breath, just a small exhalation, like air escaping through faulty walls or a trapped breath in wood. The sigh breathed in and out, slow and spasmodic, almost rhythmic. I recall the moment clearly. The manner in which the breathing appeared to synchronize with the tapping, the manner in which the silence encroached from all sides, as if the apartment were exhaling, quietly breathing beneath the rain. My mind was a blank, but no rational thought ensued. No sound reason for the noises, no reassuring rationalization, only increasing knowledge that there was something there, something insistent and unyielding. I longed to leave, to get out of the apartment and the rain and the silence, but my feet were rooted. My body was paralyzed by a fear not of shock or terror, but of quiet, deep knowledge, an intuition that whatever it was there, watching, waiting. The tapping ceased in a moment, leaving just the rain and that oppressive silence again. I rested against the floor, letting the chill seep into my clothes, and closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids in darkness, the beat of the tapping resonated, slow and steady, a beat, a pulse. Time went by. When I opened my eyes once more, it was morning. The rain ceased, and outside the world was soft and wet, cleansed of its secrets. I rose slowly and went to the window, gazing out at the gray light. The street was empty, the air cool and clean. But within me there was silence. The silence more deafening than sound. The presence that stayed after the rain ceased. In the subsequent weeks I was seeing little things, things which may have passed unnoticed previously. Shadows flitting just on the periphery of my vision, objects moved by fractions of inches, a cold patch that would tend to settle over sections of the apartment at random. I was not aware of the tapping from its first episode, nor of the breathing that came from the floorboards. But the memory of these creaks visited me, like an incomplete word in the dark. I would find myself switching on lights late at night, though they failed to reassure. The flat would never actually seem deserted. Always there was presentment without sound, vigilant, waiting to be let out by the return of the rain. I no longer sit by the window on rainy evenings. I remain in the middle of the room, close to the warmth of the vibration of the heater, wrapped in blankets that are powerless against the quiet. Something in the rain, I believe, something that opens the gate between our reality and the darkness outside. It tugs at the fringes of reality, blurs the line between what is and what could be, and occasionally, every so often, it brings with it a stillness that is not peaceful, but something different, something waiting. I find myself wondering sometimes what would have occurred if I had gotten up and gone toward that tapping under the floor. If I had attempted to listen more intently to perceive the rhythm, the breath, would I have discovered answers, or would I have discovered deeper silence? It may be better that I never know, because some silences are to be left unbroken. Some presences are to be left sequestered under the rain. And I've learned to make room for that, to embrace the stillness as a presence unto itself, a reminder that even when we're within the security of our homes, even with the coziness of a rainy evening, there are things that can't be told, things that watch and wait in the dark. I remain in that apartment but no longer look out into the rain. I leave windows closed tight, lights dimmed, door locked, and on those nights when the rain comes down in sheets, when the world is quiet and still, I lying wakeful listen, because I know the silence will give voice again, and if it does, then I pray I am ready. I couldn't help but think about that year with a kind of discomfort. The way in which some of these little things that hadn't seemed like such a big issue at the time just continued to loom larger and larger. It started with the relatively normal setup, a shared flat, a new flatmate, the familiar search for bargain accommodation in an area where rent takes a gigantic proportion of your budget. I could never have dreamt that the person I shared a room with would end up being the one to inspire silent fear, an aura that disturbed the very air I breathed in those places. The first time we met, all was just normal. She was shy, mannered, and seemed very reserved. I recall being puzzled by the fact that she was too quiet, maybe even reserved. But such things are expected to happen when you live with a stranger. The flat was tiny. 2 bedrooms, 1 common living room, a kitchen which held only 2. She hired it in time, meticulous in her ways, and spoke little, only as and when required. I justified to myself that it was best. The first few weeks passed without any issues. She spent most of her time in her own room, and I did the same, devoted to work and routine. The one thing that did strike my notice, however, was her routine, or the lack of it. She'd disappear during the day and return at strange times of night. Sometimes I could hear muffled sounds in her direction, soft footsteps, the occasional muffled thump or scrape, but nothing loud. There was quietness to her presence, a stillness of everyday human sound. She didn't listen to music, didn't have anyone over to watch TV in the living room, and never had hosts over at houses with friends. I'll admit, initially I was interested instead of being shocked. I thought she most likely had a difficult job or irregular working hours. But I did notice that her bedroom windows were always closed, curtains drawn tightly, no light coming in. She also closed her door regardless of the weather. It made little patch of darkness in what was otherwise a bright flat. One night, weeks after she'd moved in, I returned home late from work. It was cold in the air, the streets empty as the town closed up for the night. The flat was quiet, save for the soft whir of the fridge. I walked through to the kitchen to get myself a glass of water. At the sink, I saw light under her bedroom door. It was on, something I had never seen before. It was a soft, flickering light, like candlelight, though I couldn't be certain. The light moved steadily, tracing an odd path across the earth. I stood there, not knowing whether to knock or leave. A minute went by, and then I could hear a slight whisper of movement on the other side of the door. No voice, but a slight creaking noise. I told myself it was nothing, just delusion after a long day. But the light remained on all night. Days went by, and the light kept appearing at random intervals. I didn't want to ask, because I thought it would shatter the tenuous peace we had. But the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier, less welcoming. It wasn't the light. I could see the edges of something that hung around me when I was by myself, though I never glimpsed her come out of her room. There were mornings that I would emerge from my bedroom, and I would see and catch sight of her dark, shadowy form slumped still in the hallway just inside the doorway. When squarely looked at, she'd vanish. It was one morning when I woke up to find the apartment colder than mornings in the past. There was heat on, but there was this coldness present. I was making coffee in the kitchen, and I saw something odd. The calendar on the fridge was turned around, the pages reversed. It was a little thing, but definite. I didn't think I'd done it, and I didn't think she had. The thoughtfulness irritated me, but I attributed it to my own forgetfulness. Later that evening, I came home to find the locks on the apartment door had been changed. I was locked out. No warning, no explanation. I phoned the landlord, who was also shocked, saying she had no right to change locks. I stood in the hallway outside for an hour until eventually, wordlessly as ever, she arrived and let me in without a word. Her silence no longer vexed personality. It was a barrier, a line that split her half in my world. Her eyes failed to meet mine, shoulders furrowed in fear of getting caught out. The apartment, our home, was now separated by the lines I was afraid to cross. It was one evening, rain tapping against the window pane, when I saw something on the living room floor. A group of small objects, rocks, a charred matchstick, a dirty flower, neatly arranged. Not randomly, but done with intent, symmetrical in a ghastly manner. I had not seen her emerge from her room, but the objects were there, beside the doorway I used each time I went to the kitchen. I shoved them aside hastily as if to shatter the pattern. I slept not that night. Every creaking of the old house creaked loudly. Every shadow appeared more like it was crawling towards me. I stayed awake, and the rain poured in my ears, asking what was behind the shut door. Weeks on, I discovered an old diary under the couch. Not mine, and she never used a book or a notebook. The paper was yellowed, the script small and controlled. No marginal notes, no dates, only mysterious symbols and strange observations. Some of the pages were filled with drawings of circles divided by lines, others with quotes from esoteric rituals and ancient cults. I replaced it, racing heart, struggling to understand this revelation and the woman I believed I knew. Reality slipped away from my grasp. Everything changed at night. The apartment became colder, emptier, as if life had been sucked from its walls. I avoided mirrors in case I saw something other than mine staring back. I heard whispering in the night. Not loud, but on the edge of hearing, from within her bedroom. I stood there, thudding heart, staring up at the ceiling. Whispering grew more and more intense, but not quite intense enough to discern words. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like incantation. I thought about screaming, trying to shout, but my voice had stuck in my throat. Rain fell outside, its rhythmic beat strangely reassuring amidst terror. Sometime later, the whispering ceased and there fell a silence as oppressive as the eardrums could bear. I resolved after that night that I would no longer stay. The apartment no longer felt like home, but a place where unseens roamed. I packed quietly, not wanting to disturb the delicate balance. On my final morning, before I departed, I went into her room again. The curtains remained closed, the dim light still there. For an instant I would have been certain that she was leaning against the window, facing the outside, still as if one of the shadows themselves. I softly shut the door after me and departed. I was never able to find out much about her history, her purpose, or just what she was there for. My landlord informed me that she'd moved out several days later, having stripped the apartment bare again. In retrospect, I know that there are worse places left unseen. This summer had redefined absence and presence, things unseen but felt just at the edge of perception. What scares us is sometimes not what we meet face to face, but the void and shadows in between. Rain had always had this ability to calm the mind, but now that I am able to hear the rhythm of it against the window pane during the night, I find myself thinking of her, and the awkward, quiet realization that some doors are best left shut. After I'd left that apartment, I'd attempted to take the memory with me. I wound up in a new apartment myself, attempting to rebuild some sort of sense of normal. But there was something about the year that persisted, something that crept into my head silently. In the weeks that went by, I kept repeating short chunks over and over in my head, looking for something I might have overlooked. The way she would say nothing more than absolutely necessary, the soft, flickering glow behind her closed door, the muttering incantations at midnight that never coalesced into words, the odd trinkets deposited in the living room, waiting there apparently to be sacrificed to some unstated end. I never accused her of any of it. Maybe I was afraid to, or maybe because I already knew on some level that there was a world behind these walls, one that I wasn't supposed and wasn't fit to be entering. What really unsettled me was the sense of unease that lingered after I left the apartment, the sense that she never really left, that in spite of the vacant rooms and silence, the house itself seemed to hum with her presence. Months went by. Life went on, as it is wont to do. I acclimated to my new flat, slowly reintroducing my routine. But on still evenings when rain dropped methodically on my window pane, I could not help but wonder about that peculiar light. Now and again I'd play along with it as still burning just behind my own bedroom door, pacing back and forth in wait for my return. An evening rain, I had no option but to return to the old apartment building. My practical brain knew it was not the right thing to do, but something inside me wanted to peek one more time. I wanted closure, or perhaps a final knowledge of why I was haunted all these years. Standing in front of the front door, I felt the usual rush. The building seemed small now, aged and neglected. I hesitated, fingers resting on the chilled metal door handle. It opened with a push, as if no one had closed it when I departed. The apartment within was gloomy, the air heavy and stale. I flipped the switch, but the bulbs glowed feebly before they extinguished to a faint ember. The quiet was deep, broken only by the faint trickle of water somewhere in the complex. I stepped quietly from room to room, the dust and memory loosening with each step. The living room was bare, some exhausted pieces of furniture having been left behind. The calendar remained on the fridge, the torn pages as if time had been forsaken here. And then I was able to make it to her bedroom door. It stood open, the faintest whiff of that odd glow seeping from within. My heart pounded as I opened the door and stepped in. The apartment was small and messy than I remembered, dimly lit. The drapery was heavy, was closed but creaked the absolute smallest amount to let rain, cool and wet, creep within. Gentle light was provided by one lone small candle that had been lit on the sill, surrounded by the same curious cluster of rocks and flowers which had been unearthed months before. I drew near, the silence around me from every direction. On the table, the worn journal rested, the pages spread wide in a revelation of the mysterious symbols I had witnessed before. There was a turbulence in the air, a whisper so vague it became a touch upon my skin. I could nearly hear the enchantment once more, vanishing and humming, calling from the other side of the realm of comprehension. I did not have the courage to remain longer. I quietly closed the door and left the apartment forever, the flame of the candle vanishing behind the thick curtains. The following days, the memories were no longer ghosts, but echoes, recollection of a border past, of reality caught sight of for an instant. I found there are individuals who possess worlds within themselves that cannot be expressed, and some doors that, having been opened, do not close willingly. I never saw her again, and I didn't look. I never found out her name, where she was from, or why she had decided to live in the small dark room behind a door that never quite opened. But on quiet nights, when the rain pours down, I still ponder about that apartment, about the candle-lit moving shadows and the muffled whispers that lingered in the darkness. It can be a reminder that there is always something more beneath the surface of the mundane, and there are depths beyond our own knowing. That sometimes the most disturbing things are not the visible or the audible, but the invisible, the place between light and darkness, sound and silence. I tell this tale not to fright, but in order to impart a lesson learned for me. Things are never what we think they are, and others close by can mess with us in ways unimaginable. There are times I am sitting waiting to hear a whisper, an unsettling glow, as if somewhere over our horizon, that quiet room remains. And while I've been dead for centuries, that queasy sense of unease, The gentle, insistent feeling that certain things should be left untouched never really went away. I catch myself wondering sometimes if she was ever truly there to begin with, or if she was something other, something that slides through the interstices between us, in the empty space of a location where windows never shut and lamps never are extinguished. Rain just keeps coming, slow and steady. And in that quiet beat, I am soothed and at a muffled terror, the ideal soundtrack to a hushed story, a memory branded in the dark, and an impression felt on the cusp of sleep. It was just another run-of-the-mill night to start with. Nothing unusual. I'd worked late that evening. Just the kind of dull, stiff shift where your brain drifts off more than it stays focused. By the time I finished work, I was hungry, tired, and set to go home. The closest fast food place was a 10-minute drive away, and I was too exhausted to cook, so I figured I'd swing by for some food. It was late, past midnight, and the parking lot was nearly empty. I remember the gentle hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, the manner in which their light flashed every now and then as I inched my car through the drive-through lane. The air was chilly and wet from a previous rain, and the world beyond the vehicle was slippery and wet to the hand. The road behind me was deserted, save the distant occasional growl of a car coming. I talked into the speaker, my voice dry and raspy. There was a moment's quiet, then muffled voice answered back the other way. In unnatural perhaps for a drive-through, but long enough to become agony-makingly uncomfortable in the black quiet. It was a quiet like the sort where even the gap between the sounds felt overwhelming, heavy on your chest. When I ordered, I crept over to the window to pay. Streetlights cast long shadows on the wall of the building. I noticed something unusual, but at the time dismissed it. A small person standing very close to the front window of the restaurant. I had thought originally it was going to be a reflection, or one of the servers hanging around handing out orders, but there was something in the manner of the figure's movement that didn't exactly ring true. I handed over my card, and the window person, still quite in the dark, gave me my receipt with minimal eye contact. It was remote. Remote. Not the friendly, desperate atmosphere you get late at night in somewhere like this. I opened my window and waited, looking out over the empty lot. The rain had stopped, but the clouds were still gray and a creepy quiet lay over everything. There were no cars driving by or coming in, and no sounds other than the plop, plop, plop of water from the gutters. A minute after, the window opened again and they passed food. But this individual's hand was shaking a bit. This small thing had stuck in my head, although I had reminded myself that it was fatigue or maybe cold. As I bent forward to take the food, I caught a brief look of the face behind the glass. The shadows from the lowered light provided perfect vision. Their eyes were, however, an abnormally dark shade, far too dark to be natural. I blinked and adjusted my head, racing heart for seemingly no reason. Swerving from the road, I had a feeling of unease descend upon me, as if the atmosphere had changed ever so slightly. It was delicate, but certain, a soft tension that hadn't been there before. On the ride home, the roads were empty and slippery, headlights catching wet pavement. I couldn't help but relive that moment by the window, how that shape changed, how their eyes seemed. Empty. Something was off with it. Not threatening in a fleeting way, but tremendously unsettling. That night I could not shake from my head that I had witnessed something that I ought not to have. Facts would not fall into line in my head. Was it a monster? Or a mirage? A shadow? I just kept on attempting to make sense of it out. But the more I worried, the more it appeared to be a reflection of something else. Something beneath the surface of things. In the days that passed, I flinched every time I passed by that very fast food restaurant. The memory of the shaking hand and the black empty eyes stayed with me. I never once saw the figure, but the silent terror persisted. It was the silent, unseen pressure that pressed against just below my ribcage, reminding me that some things were better not seen. It is strange how such an ordinary place, A drive-through window where you expect nothing better than cheap food and unexciting contact can be so eerily quiet. What I discovered that night was not gruesome or sensationalized. It was more unsettling in that it was so quiet, so nonchalant, like a cold draft on the back of your head in a vacant room. And every now and then I'll find myself thinking if it ever even happened, or if a tired mind twisted something good into something evil. No matter how much I shake it and attempt to brush it off, the sensation remains. The sensation that there are moments fleeting and lost on everyone else, where the world sets down a veneer for a little while and shows something else. Something which waits patiently in store. I went driving that night, holding the steering wheel an inch tighter than normal. The dinner remained untouched on the passenger seat of the car, abandoned. My brain was unable to shake the picture of those eyes, those impossible dark, hollow eyes staring out in the window through the darkness. There wasn't anything inside, no spark of recognition or compassion, but a lack of anything human. I was continually telling myself again and again that it must have been a sleepy employee or the blackness playing tricks with my brain. Something inside of me knew otherwise. I stayed away from that fast food place the remainder of those days. Each time I would consider going back, I had a creeping sensation of dread rising up in the pit of my stomach, as if something intangible was lurking there, waiting for me to return. The mundane distractions of the real world, work, friends, the drudge of it all, were not sufficient to push the memory away. Horror did not evaporate. It snuck in like a mist. It was small, hardly perceptible at first, little things slightly out of place that do not quite fit. I went by the restaurant one evening coming home from work. The parking lot was empty, the building dark but for a lone quivering light in the area of the drive-through window. My eyes caught something moving, a person standing just beyond, silent and still, in the same place where I had noticed the eyes. But when I blinked once more, it was gone. It was then that the real discomfort began. It was no longer the memory of the eyes. It was deeper, an impression that the ground, the evening, and even I were changed in some way. I started feeling things I could not articulate. Unsounded noises, the gentle scrape of nails on glass, the brush of air on the breeze, the near silent scuffle of feet behind me when I was alone walking. I slept that evening because I could hear the rain drizzling slowly against the window pane. It was calming, but I wasn't comfortable. My mind kept going back to that drive-through window, to the trembling hand that had given me my food. Why would this person be so relaxed and shake so? And those eyes, empty, yet somehow searching for something. I tried to tell myself that fatigue was clouding my mind, but even in my saner periods, a chilled numbness of fear coiled tightly at the back of my stomach. Sleep crept up on me. I kept envisioning the shape looking at me through the blackness outside my window, balanced on the edge of existence from the light cast by the street lamp. I was envisioning the icy, vacant eyes with a spectral cast of thought, like two black abysses reaching for something unthinkable in the night. Days passed. Memory became harder to keep hidden. I caught myself wondering if I had stuck my hand where I shouldn't have stuck it. The border of a presence just beneath the surface of normal life. Something that sits and waits. Something old. Something that thrives on silence and darkness. Finally, I coaxed myself back to that drive-through. I rationalized it to myself as nothing, a building full of fatigued workers doing their job. But when I slid into the lane, that same familiar suffocating stillness fell around me like a pall. I too requested the same, my voice softer than ever before. The phone crackled with static, remained silent for an inordinately long time, and then answered. My heart pounded against my ribs. Standing by the window, the same trembling hand extended, but this time without a face attached to it. Just the hand, trembling and white. I passed over my card and took the receipt, but the food was not to be seen. The window slid shut silently, creaking open slowly, metal frame gently clanking home. I simply stood there, confused. The window did not open. No one came back. I sat in the car, headlights off, waiting to see if something would occur. Nothing. No voice. No steps. Quiet. and the soft patter of water dripping off the roof. A minute later, I glared out of the window once more, jammed tighter than tight. I gunned the engine and crept forward slowly. Once I left the parking lot behind, I cast a glance backwards over my shoulder in the rearview mirror. The window, dark and stationary, no stir, no breathing. Just flashing streetlight tossing long shadows through the empty parking lot. I did not eat the food when I got home that night. I just left it sitting on the counter, unopened and untouched, and refusing even to open the bags. Days turned to weeks, but the memory lingered, growing like a quiet ache beneath the surface of my mind. The unsettling feeling never fully left me. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow in a dark corner or a pair of empty eyes watching from a distance. I have no idea what I saw at that drive-thru. I don't even know if I saw it. But it changed something in me. It made me realize how fine the line is between normalcy and oddness. How something as mundane as ordering dinner can run head-on into the unknown if you find yourself in the right or wrong place at the right time. I sometimes wonder if the location is haunted, or if whatever it was chases the living, waiting for the next occasion that the night is quiet and no one else is around to see. If you ever find yourself at a drive-thru on a late night and the air will suddenly get cold, or the silence just gets too oppressive, listen. Glance closely at the shadows. Because sometimes, just beneath the level of ordinary normalcy, something else occurs. Waiting, watching, and you can very likely be the next to see. It's strange how silence can go from being comforting to suffocating. How the same silence that rocks you into sleep can begin to claw at your brain when you're actually by yourself. I loved being alone, or at least I thought I did, until one night altered everything I ever knew about being alone. That happened around late autumn 2 years ago. The kind of cold where the wind bites your cheeks and the wind whisks by like it's whispering secrets along the sides of the house. I'd just come back to my hometown after graduation. One of those little towns that lay between dark forest and worn fields. My parents were away for the week visiting my aunt out west, and I'd offered to hold down the house. It was an easy decision. I liked their premises. It was quiet, comfortable, and as it happened, the ideal place for me to unwind at that moment. The house is not old itself, but it has that kind of silence you get from objects that have seen many years go by. Not anything spooky. Just a small 2-story home with a long gravel driveway, a detached garage, and a tall row of trees bordering the backyard like a wall of shadows. There was nothing unusual during the initial days. I sat and read most of the time, paced around the grounds, or stood gazing at rain, since there was never anything but rain that week. A soft, persistent drizzle that caused the windows to steam up and the trees outside the house to look like something breathing. I remember finding the patter comforting, the unending beat of sound that filled up the houses with a sort of low rumble. It brought the house to life in a gentle kind of way. But by the third night, something was amiss. It started with something trivial. I was lounging in the living room reading at midnight, the fire dying down to coals. The only other light came from a gentle lamp behind the couch. Outdoors, rain fell harder. No thunder. Just that insistent, steady fall of rain that blotted out every other sound. That's when I felt it. Not heard. Felt a pressure. As if someone had entered the room and stood behind me. I turned around slowly, expecting someone to be there. Of course, no one. The room was just the same as it had been all night. But I got up and double-checked the doors. Front, back, even the basement door, were all locked. Windows too. I even turned on the light outside on the porch and looked out into the yard. The rain kept from being able to see very far, but everything seemed to be where it belonged. I had attributed it to exhaustion. I hadn't been sleeping as much that week. The house tended to shift and creak at odd times, and with the wind blowing constantly through the trees, it was hard to settle fully into sleep. I figured I was just anxious from the storm. The second day dragged on. I couldn't shake that other sensation from the previous night, as if the house had breathed something into me, some kind of knowledge it didn't have before. I kept looking over my shoulder, trying to hear something I couldn't quite make out. I left all the lights on that night. I cooked dinner with music playing, trying to fill the room with normalcy. It worked. For a moment. Later that evening, I was upstairs brushing my teeth. The rain was pounding against the skylight in the bathroom, and I stopped for a second to gaze up at it, raindrops running down the glass like veins. That's when I heard something, not outside, inside the house. A gentle thump downstairs, then another. I stood stock still. It wasn't the house settling. I know what that sounds like. This was rhythmic, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart started racing. I shut off the faucet and stayed silent, waiting. Nothing. Just rain again. I reminded myself it could have been something that fell, maybe one of the books that were on the coffee table. I crept out into the hall from the bathroom and peered down the hallway. The house was still. There was too much stillness. That sort of heavy, waiting stillness that makes you feel like someone is waiting to hear you think. I came down the stairs, step by step, holding my breath. Everything was as I had left it. No books on the floor, no open doors. I even looked in the closets. They were vacant. But I still did not sleep that night well. The real change took place on the fifth night. I was lying in bed, awake, listening to the rain beat against the windows. I'd started leaving on the hallway light, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. There was something comforting in that narrow strip of light coming under the bedroom door. I don't know what time it was, but I remember the feeling that pulled me back from the edge of sleep. Not a sound, not a dream, just a presence. As if someone were in the room with me. I had opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling. My room was black, but I could still see that thin line of light at the bottom of the door. And that is when I saw it. A shadow crossed over it, not soon, not so much as a flicker, but a gradual, steady shattering of light, as if someone had just on the other side of my door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just watched, heart thumping, as the shadow crept once again and disappeared. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like hours. At last, I gathered enough strength to get out of bed. I moved out of the room very slowly, expecting, what? I don't know. A face? A presence? But the hall was empty. I double-checked every room, every lock, every window, nothing. I even went out onto the porch in pajamas and let the rain permeate my shirt. The world seemed abnormally still for the kind of weather, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I didn't return to sleep. I simply sat in the living room with lights on, listening to the rain until sunrise. The next morning I started to convince myself that it was a dream, a waking nightmare at best. My mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house, that I hadn't been alone for days. There were some other small things afterward as well. Lights that I'm positive I had switched off stayed on in the mornings. A glass was moved an inch to the left. Cold spots within rooms that shouldn't be cold. Once I awoke to the door to the attic open in the ceiling hallway slightly ajar, though I hadn't even walked past it. But only on the last night did I feel actual fear. I had started sleeping in the downstairs living room on the couch. It made me feel in control, closer to the doors, more stable. That night, the rain drummed on persistently, its beat like 1,000 tiny taps on the roof. I had myself all swaddled in a blanket and tried to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not by noise, but by the feeling. You know that thing where you feel like you're being watched? It was strong. I woke up, and the very first thing I saw was the front door. It was open, slightly, a little. There was porch light illuminating, and I could see the rain coming sideways in the wind. But the door was open. I sat up, slowly, all the nerves screaming. I had locked that door. I always locked it. I got up, trying not to make a sound, and closed it quietly. I turned the lock, then double-checked it. Still locked. That's when I noticed the wet footprints. Weak, but unmistakable. From the door, into the hallway. Bare feet. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. Instead, I stood up from the couch and sat back down again, blanket wrapped tightly around me, and waited. Rain continued to pour down, and somewhere deep in the house, I heard a tiny creak of a floorboard. I lay awake all morning. As the sun came up, I packed. I sent a note to my parents, something vague about not being well and having to go back to my apartment early. I did not tell them what happened. Not exactly. Even now, I'm not sure how to explain it. There was never any violence, never any proof. But something was in that house with me. Something that watched, that waited, that made itself known only when the world was quiet enough to hear it. I still visit my parents, but I don't stay overnight. I always depart before dusk, no matter the excuse. And whenever I'm there, I find myself glancing at the shadows, listening for that quiet after rain. Because once you've truly been not alone, once you've had that in you, in your bones, it never quite departs. And the worst part is, I don't believe it ever left that house either. Even after I had returned to my apartment in the city, the presence remained, in mind, if not in body. I tried to fall into routine. Classes, chores, binging meaningless shows late at night to drown out the lingering silence. But something had shifted in me, and I felt it most in quiet. I started sleeping with the television going. Hallway lights blazed until dawn. Not because I believed whatever was in that house followed me, but because it had changed my view of darkness. I never said a word. Not really. What was I supposed to say? That I was being followed at home? That the door opened on its own? That prints were made where nobody walked? I knew it sounded delusional, and with each new day, everything seemed like some dream that I could not awaken from. Until 2 weeks later. My mother phoned me. Relaxed at first, wanting to know how I was, complaining about a new recipe she'd attempted, the typical little things. But then her voice changed, ever so slightly. She wanted to know if I'd been up to the attic before I'd left. I said no, never. I hated that room. Even when I was a kid, I'd avoided it. She told me she had wondered about it, since when they got home the attic light was on. Not just on, but the light bulb was flashing. And then on top of that, the old steamer trunk they kept upstairs, the one filled with my grandfather's things, had been pulled out into the middle of the floor. She smiled faintly as she said it, as though she was waving it off. Most probably the house settling again, she joked. You know how it is when the rain pours down like that, the things move around. But I knew she didn't believe it, not one bit. I questioned her if something else was odd. She hesitated, and then she said something that wrapped my stomach. The front door, it was open when we came home. Wide open, actually. I thought you might have forgotten to pull it shut, but you never have done that before. I hadn't. I remembered locking it. Twice. After I had examined the footprints, after I had stared into that spilling blackness and recognized that someone or something had been in the house with me. I did not sleep that night. 2 days later, I went back to visit them. I told myself that I was paranoid, that if there was something wrong, it was better to face it. Maybe everything would be okay in the daylight. The house was exactly the same. Too same. Neat. Untouched. My parents were happy, and I did not want to cause them concern. So I walked the halls, alone, quietly checking the doors, the locks, the hatch up into the attic. Everything was fine. I almost let myself feel reassured until I went into the upstairs guest room. On the window, lightly etched on the condensation, were fingerprints. 4 lines of long drag slowly downwards, as though they had laid a hand on the glass and withdrawn it. I was standing there staring at them, trying to find meaning where there was none. My parents will not go in that room. They have it locked off. It was my older brother's room before he left. I wiped the glass clean and said nothing. That was months ago. Nothing ever actually happened again, but the house changed afterward. at least to me. It wasn't home anymore. Not exactly. It became a place of quiet tension, of shadows that appeared to settle inward, of footsteps you couldn't track and cold spots that lingered too long. One night on a spring trip, I stayed after dark. I was talking to my mother at the kitchen table when she stiffened, furrowed brow. "Did you just go down to the basement?" she asked. I hadn't. She scowled in the direction of the stairs, her face taut. I could have sworn I heard someone moving around down there. We both stood there. Nothing. No sound. She did a nervous laugh and dismissed it. Probably the dryer. It likes to thump. But they weren't doing laundry. I knew that. I haven't returned since. They've never experienced anything really frightening. Nothing they've ever told me anyway. No groaning doors. No rain imprint on the floor. But I do know something shifted in that house during those 7 days. Maybe it was always present, waiting, watching for someone to stay alone long enough to notice it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone down those footsteps through the corridor that night. If I'd have pushed the door open at the end and looked inside whatever lay just on the other side. I think something in me knew better, because the house did not want to be gazed at. It wanted to be touched. And it was. Even now, when I listen to the rain during the night, I catch myself recollecting that week. The stillness among the drops. The manner in which the house breathed around me. Slow and deliberate. They tell you solitude is peaceful. But sometimes when you are truly by yourself, that's when it first gets the room to seep in. And whatever it is, it never leaves. It just waits. I never considered myself a touchy-feely individual. I don't get scared easily, and I don't believe what doesn't have sense. Ghosts, spirits, all that. I used to put it in with fairy tales. Things people came up with to make them feel as though they had an explanation for the inexplicable. I wasn't that kind of person. Or at least I wasn't. I returned to my hometown after college. The urban life had drained me. Too noisy, too busy. I wanted peace, isolation. So when I saw the ad for that little house at the outskirts of town, I grabbed it. The price was fair, maybe even too fair, but I didn't push my fortune. I just wanted something to own. It was an old, mid-century house with a sloping porch and sun siding that had faded. When you entered, the boards creaked, and the windows let in more cold than they did light. But I didn't mind. It was isolated from all that. Quiet, something I hadn't known in years. The house sat on a tiny lot, but the yard was surprisingly large. It rolled out behind the house in clumpy patches of grass, far out toward a wall of trees that was as thick as anything I'd ever seen where I grew up. The forest was thicker than anything I'd ever known, the type of place that devoured sound, that remained stationary even when the wind caused everything else to sway. I spent my first few weeks getting settled, fixing up small things around the house. Replacing worn hardware, cleaning, organizing. In the mornings, I'd sit on the back steps with my coffee and just listen. The world back there had a rhythm all its own. Birds calling in slow waves, insects clicking softly beneath the grass, the scent of damp soil, pine, and something else. Something sweet and unfamiliar. Initially, I comforted myself that I was merely decompressing, that after all those years of overload, my brain was simply adjusting to the quiet. But there was something more than that. Something less descriptive. It began slowly, the way most strange things do. I was cutting the backyard one morning and noticed something strange. A small area of grass near the edge of the trees that seemed not to be growing. The rest of the lawn had broken through springtime, but this patch remained yellow and hard. More like it had been burned or stepped on enough times to kill it dead several times. I tried to reseed it. Watered it more than the rest. Nothing. The grass there would not grow. About the same week, I started seeing little piles of rocks stacked up along the back property line, just beyond the tree line. They weren't very big or impressive, just little rounded rocks stacked in threes or fours. I thought they were put there by kids cutting through, but they just kept appearing. Always at night, always in a different location. Sometimes I'd catch sight of them on the porch. Once, I discovered one on the windowsill outside my bedroom. It was wrong. Not frightening, actually, but too intentional to ignore. I knocked them down whenever I could see them, but they'd keep returning, reassembled in different ways, sometimes taller. I started to feel like I was being watched, even during the day. The backyard, which had been my favorite part of the house, now became one I dreaded. I continued to maintain it, automatically instead of comfortably. I started to get my chores done quicker, though. I never stayed outside once the sun fell too low. I couldn't put my finger on why. Not that anything occurred precisely, but the atmosphere changed, grew colder, thicker. It was around this time that the dreams began. They started small, flashes of trees at night or the sound of feet passing over dry leaves in the dark. But they increased. In one, I was lying on the lawn, staring up at the stars, and there was something curled beside me. I did not see it, but I felt its breath on my cheek. In another one, I strolled through the forest in the backyard of my house, and I found there dozens of stacks of stones, stretching endlessly. Each one higher than the next, but the worst nightmare was not the same. I was at home, standing at the back window. Dark but full moon, so it was a pale silver light over the backyard. I could see something standing at the edge of the trees. Tall. Still. Its arms were absurdly long. It didn't move, it didn't need to. I couldn't wake up. I just kept staring until I felt it staring back. When I eventually woke up with a jerk, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I swore it was a dream. But the next morning there was another pile of stones, this time on my back step. I considered telling someone, a friend, a neighbor. What was I possibly going to say, however? That rocks were appearing in my yard? That I had a dream and now I'm scared of my own lawn? I quit opening the blinds at the back of the house. Soon after, the disturbances during the night worsened. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. with a start. Every night. Always with the feeling that somebody had just been looking at me. The sort of pressure that is like having someone in the room. I began to go around locking and unlocking the locks repeatedly. I stopped going near the windows. One night, I finally worked up the courage to look. I reminded myself that it was to show that there was nothing there, to stop feeding the fear. I crawled out of bed, crossed the room, and pushed aside a strand of the curtain. The backyard was still, quiet, empty. But the moment I began to breathe once more, I saw it. Out of sight, barely visible at the farthest line of the trees, was a form, unmoving, unswaying in the wind, like the nearby branches. It was too angular, too determined. A form, watching. I froze. I gazed at it for minutes at least, but it never moved. Eventually, I closed the curtain and drew back, heartbeat thudding against my chest. I slept not at all the rest of the night. The next day, the grass alongside the trees was ruffled, a gentle line of pressed earth leading from the woods to the house. The line stopped at the porch, and near the porch was a handprint. Not a footstep. One distinct handprint pressed into the ground. The fingers were long, too long. I considered leaving. I even packed a couple of boxes, but I didn't leave. Something within me still held on to the hope that it was all in my head. Lack of sleep, maybe. Anxiety. There had to be a logical explanation. But it didn't stop. Over the following weeks, the lights began flashing more aggressively. Not just the porch light, but even the hallway light. I changed the bulbs, checked the wiring. They continued to flash. Always around the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Sometimes I'd find my back door left ajar. I always locked it before going to sleep. I'm a nut about those things. But 3 times in a row, I woke up to find it open. Just an inch or so. Like someone had checked it, or worse, entered, and then left. I began placing a chair in front of the handle at night. Not that anything going in was going to be stopped by it, but it made me feel slightly better, as if I still had some say. And then one night, I heard the sound. It was weak, so weak I wondered if I dreamed it. A faint scraping noise from outside and like fingernails scratching agonizingly across the wood of the back door. Not fast, not hard, just slow, slowly rhythmic. I didn't stir. I lay in bed, listening, eyes wide in the darkness. It went on for a few minutes and then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The next day, the paint on the back door was scratched. Not deep, but noticeable. I ceased sleeping after that. I began staying awake all night, lights on, in the front room, the one area of the house that wasn't in the direction of the backyard. I drank coffee until morning, then slept a few hours during the day. It wasn't a pace that could be maintained, but it was safer. And yet even when it was daytime, I could feel it. The presence. Watching. Waiting. One afternoon, desperate, I stepped into the backyard. I do not know what I hoped to do. I walked through to the trees, heart beating hard against my chest. The air appeared to grow chillier as I walked closer. I hesitated at the lawn edge. The woods ahead of me seemed darker than it should have been at the hour. I waited for a moment, listening. Nothing. Just silence. Heavy, thick silence. Then somewhere off in the woods, a light tap, as if someone were knocking softly on an empty tree. Once, twice, 3 times. I turned and went back towards the house. That night I dreamed again. But this time I was in the woods. I wasn't by myself. Something moved beside me, just out of reach. Its breath was moist. The trees pulsed like lungs. When I woke up, I found another pile of stones in the house. On the floor beside the back door, neatly piled. I hadn't had it open. That was the straw that broke me. I filled up as much as I could in my car and drove away that day. I didn't mind violating the lease. I didn't mind losing my deposit. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was in another state. It's been nearly a year now since I walked out of that house. I still fantasize about the backyard, of those trees and the something that lived just behind them. I've tried to make sense of it, to tell myself I dreamed most of it. But the memory never goes away. If anything, it gets stronger. Occasionally I still wake up at 2:17 a.m., racing heart, sure something's standing just outside my window. Not here, but somewhere, as if it followed. I've never gone back. I've never told anyone exactly what happened. Not because I'm afraid that they wouldn't understand, but because I'm afraid that they would. Some places were not meant to be lived in. Some earth remembers things we don't know about. The backyard wasn't just part of the property. It was part of something old, something alive. And whatever it was, it paid attention. Rain was falling gently outside the window, a constant drumbeat that would have been soothing if I weren't where I was. I was alone in a tiny cabin deep in the woods, somewhere I had deliberately traveled, wanting to get away from the noise of daily life and find some stillness. What I found was anything but still. I must tell you about that week, how it started off ordinary, nearly routine, and how slowly, over days, had become a nagging but subdued presence that gnawed on the peripheries of my mind. The cabin was small, nestled between enormous pines and maples, leaves whispering gently in the crisp autumn wind. It was my uncle's, an old man who'd owned the property for decades, but never came more than a handful of times a year. When he invited me to spend a week there in solitude, I leapt at the opportunity. No Wi-Fi, no cell phone, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the gradual flow of time. The day was quiet. I arranged my meager possessions, stoked a small fire in the wood heater, and sat by the window as the sun moved across the hills. The silence was thick, but not claustrophobic. There was something authentic about it, a raw link with the world without the thrum of machines or the din of human voices. Rain came at night, a light patter initially, then forcefully and rhythmically. The rain felt strangely reassuring. I heard as I fell asleep, the wind toying with leaves outside. The following morning, the forest was revivified. The wet soil shone in the shadow of the forest, and a soft mist clung to the ground. I set out to visit the trails nearby. The trail was single file, weaving through dense forest, the branches above forming a cathedral ceiling. I walked by myself and was serene. I hadn't been for years. The more I moved into the woods, I felt a strange quietness. The familiar tweet of a bird or squirrel was missing. Even the wind had been muzzled. I attributed it as part of the weather. The storm must have driven out the animals. I went back to the cabin and observed rain had fallen again, pounding relentlessly off the roof. I quit again indoors with a book, the fire crackling quietly to one side. At night, I awoke once or twice, the rain more loudly now, pounding against the windows. The wind was blowing more strongly, flexing the trees so the branches creaked against the siding of the cabin. I had heard a tapping at one point outside, something similar to a branch slamming against something softly. It did not frighten me. That was a forest. Branches break, creatures wander by, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that some other entity waited just on the other side of the door, observing. I woke for a bit, listening to the storm. The space between the drops almost sounded as loud as the rain itself. The days passed slowly. I read for hours, wrote, and walked occasionally on the trails. Every time I went outside, I could feel the forest's eyes upon me, though I never could determine where. It was as if the trees themselves watched, their interest unspoken. I saw something else one afternoon at the edge of the clearing, a neat little pile of stones placed just so on a downed log. I hadn't noticed it before. The stones were flat and smooth, purposefully arranged. I felt a strange unease, a built-in warning not to mess with them. I left them alone. As night began to fall, the rain returned, and I was attracted this time to sit by the window for hours, gazing out into the black woods beyond. The cabin light was warm, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then something drew my attention. Right at the edge of the tree line, where the shadows were heavy, I thought I saw someone, a dark figure standing still. My heart was racing, but when I blinked again, no one was there. I convinced myself it was a piece of light or the trees rocking in the wind. But the feeling remained. Sleep for that evening was not to be. Rain the previous night sounded different and more insistent, nearly restless. At midnight, I was wakened from bed by hearing a faint tread, as of someone pacing upon the wooden porch. I reassured myself that it was wind or some lost creature, but the steps were deliberate, slow, thoughtful. I stood stock still, listening with every sense of hearing for something else, but nothing else occurred. Storm raged until dawn, the rain unceasing. The days that followed saw the tension increase. I was jumping at every creak and snap. The woods were no longer friendly but vigilant and waiting. One morning there were more piles of stones near the cabin, little cairns constructed with greater care and intricacy. Someone had been by or something. There were no prints in the dirt around them, only the carefully placed rocks. I didn't say it aloud, but in my mind I questioned if I wasn't alone. It was darkest during the night. The rain was a relentless pounding that filled the stillness. The shadows danced at the edges of windows, forms I couldn't quite form. A low, drawn-out moan once tore the woods, a sound so human and so warped, as though it had traveled through blankets of distance and time. Every morning I was a little empty, a little sorry for what was. On the fifth evening, the mood changed. The rain decreased to a misty drizzle, and the wind stopped. The forest slumbered gently. I woke to see a soft light in the window, far away but distinct. Outside among trees, lights flashed. like lanterns in the distance traveling steadily, very near to floating. They never drew near, never showed a form, but were there. I wasn't scared, but felt only deep sadness and a curious hunger, as if the lights were trying to tell me something just out of my reach. I departed that morning in no great hurry, gathering my belongings. The forest had increased in depth, more oppressive in a manner I'd never known. The stillness was thicker, weighing down against my chest. I made one final trip to the clearing with the cairns before I departed. The cairns weren't there, just a single perfect circle of rocks where the little patch of earth rested. I bent to touch the chill of the stones, and for an instant, I felt a part of something huge and ancient, something older than the trees themselves. As we set off, the woods and cabin faded out of sight, shrouded by mist and rain. The quietness within the vehicle was so suffocating, and the memories of those nights lay on my mind. I've come back to the city, to noise, to light, to buzz of humanity, but the woods stay with me. Not that I can comprehend, but a whisper that some places are concealed and not to be breached, and some silences are louder than any storm. I tell this tale not to scare, but to remind us that the unknown prefers to move in on the most unlikely of territories, in the quiet, in the rain, in the trees' shadows. And sometimes all we can do is listen. Even today, months since that trip, my mind continues to wander back to the cabin and the forest that surrounded it. It was not the physical surroundings that disturbed me, but something much more intangible, an intangible change in perception that I cannot get rid of. After I left the cabin, I had hoped the bizarre occurrences would fade away like a disappearing dream. But rather than that, a repressed feeling of unease accompanied me to the city and wove itself into the fabric of my daily life and haunted my nights. I attempted to return to normal life as soon as I could. The city, its lights and sounds, should have been a haven. But everywhere I went, I still heard the rain inside my head. That constant, insistent beating on wood and leaves. The woods had entered inside me, a beat that I could not silence. At night, on the wakeful ones when I was unable to sleep, I could still see the flashing lights in the distance beyond the trees, far and indistinct, at the edge of my field of vision. I doubted my own mind, questioned if it was due to exhaustion or suggestion that produced delusions from my recollections. And then the dreams. Not dreams, no, but something more. Half-remembered moments oozing away between sleep and waking. I stood again in the clearing, hunched down beside the ring of stones. The air was heavy with wet ground and pine, and the still light of those lights far away rode just beyond the ends of trees. During these times, I sensed something around me from the darkness, something old and patient. I woke up from one of these dreams to discover my apartment abnormally cold, even though the heater had been turned on. The air felt heavy and lifeless, like the forest before rain. A distant, measured tapping resounded somewhere in the quietness. Quiet. My heart pounded, but I rationalized it was nothing, the lingering effect of those woods still present. But the feeling grew every day. I began to notice small things slightly awry, shadows that clung too long in corners, a fleeting look at something just out of sight. I was looking out my window one night as the rain rolled in across the city streets when I saw something strange. Between the streetlights and cars, there was a figure of someone standing at the edge of the park across from my apartment building. The figure was immobile, surrounded by a black coat with their back turned. I blinked hard and looked again. The figure vanished. A cold wave surrounded me, the same sensation that I had when I believed I saw the shape by the cabin, the same still fear. I realized then that the forest hadn't just remained inside me, it had followed me home. I started investigating the cabin's location. Old records and newspapers had whiffs of tales I wasn't aware of. Lost souls, bizarre parties, moonlights in the woods. The people murmured quietly of the watchers, the mythical beings rumored to keep the woods and their secrets under watch. No concrete facts, only horror and legend. The truth no longer counted for me, however. Whether real or not, the sense of being watched could not be dismissed. One evening I felt the urge to go back to the cabin. I was telling myself that I was going back to confront my fears, to regain the peace that I had been searching for. But deep inside, I knew I was looking for answers to something that I was not yet ready to comprehend. As I emerged from the train, the woods did not resemble at all what I had left behind. Quieter, darker. The fog hung thickly around the ground, curling like smoke among the trees. The air was colder than before, and the rain was falling thinly, as if the woods themselves were exhaling. The cabin stood empty still, its windows staring blankly. But the rock circle was there, neat as I'd left it. I knelt beside the fire that evening, the fire capering against the rolling black. The rain beat down on the roof, and the forest lay in wait. And then I saw them, the lights that flashed just at the trees. They were closer this time, and more brilliant. I did not feel fear, but rather a heavy stillness, as if the time itself was slowed. The lights crawled along the woods, like old lanterns lighting up an old neglected trail. I stood and remained there as a murmur arose in the rain, quiet and indeterminate and relentless. I could feel it envelop me, cold and unyielding, filling the space between the drops, and awareness seeped over me. There are things that must not be known. The forest was full of memories with custodians older than years. It preserved its own secrets, indifferent to human existence. I departed the cabin once more at first light, fog falling over the trail behind me. The forest still held me, but I had surrendered to its grasp. In the city, at home, still the rain rains down. Every so often late at night, when the world is still, I can nearly hear the pounding on wood and leaves, not outside but inside me. It's a reminder that the distance between here and there, between what we do know and what we don't know, is not as far as we imagine. And at times, when the rain moves slowly and softly, I find myself dreaming about going back to the cabin in the woods, to hear again the whispering trees and quiet witnesses. But for now I keep away, because some spots keep secrets to themselves, and the quiet isn't always empty. There is a certain kind of stillness that only happens when the world has descended into the late night hours. It isn't quite a hollow silence, but a dense one, as if the air itself gasps its breath, waiting for something to happen. I am familiar with this stillness, for it was the backdrop of my life for roughly 7 months. I worked nights at a little 24-hour convenience store just outside of town, a job I took on necessity, and one that I never quite forgot. The initial time I started, the labor felt dull. The store itself wasn't exactly anything to admire. A tiny fluorescent-lit box wedged between a defunct gas station and a no-frills strip mall. It was the kind of place you only knew existed if you happened to drive by it at night, or if you were desperately seeking a pack of smokes or an all-night snack. The regular hours were graveyard, midnight to 8 a.m. At first, the hour felt strange. So unnatural to be awake when everyone else was asleep. But before I knew it, I was accustomed to it. The early nights were mellow. I just stocking items, wiping off countertops, greeting the occasional stray customer who looked as tired as I did too. I liked the quiet. The tranquility was rejuvenating. There was a rhythm to the evening, the flick of the neon on the outside, the hum of the old freezer boxes, the occasional ching of the vending machine. But it was during those quiet hours that I first began to realize something was amiss. Not immediately, of course, nothing overt, anything obvious. No darting shadows from around corners, no strange voices whispering from the aisles. Just the gradual creep, evasive and vague. A persistent feeling as though I was not alone whatsoever, when I was alone. There was one evening which I recall vividly. I was alone, as I usually was, the clock striking just after 2 a.m. The rain had started earlier and was now lightly pattering on the windows. The repetitive washing of the water down the glass was oddly comforting, a steady background to the silence. I stood behind the counter, tallying stock on my clipboard. The store was empty, apart from the occasional automobile passing down the street outside. I glanced at the security screens, the grainy black and white images of the aisles, the front door, the parking lot. Nothing unusual. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something on the screen for the back aisle. A flutter. Movement. For one brief moment, I could have sworn I saw someone standing tall, just at the rear of the shelves. I turned and stood looking straight down the aisle. Nothing. I brushed it off. Probably just me being imaginative or the light tricking me. Working nights can mess with your head after all. Lack of sleep has a funny way of making shadows turn into things and things turn into people. However, I could not help but feel a sudden prickly nervousness creeping into my chest. The shop seemed to suddenly become cold. I wrapped my arms across myself and glanced back over my shoulder at the screen. The flicker was gone. As the night crept on, the sensation never went away. It grew stronger, a growing tide of unease just over the threshold of my awareness. I struggled to focus on the task at hand, to tidy, to replace, to be productive. But the quiet thickened, like the darkness seeping in around me. And then the quiet sound of steps. I was behind the counter when I heard it. A gentle, exploratory tapping, sounding faintly from the aisle behind me. I froze. The store was supposed to be empty. Nobody else should have been there. I told myself it must be the creaking of the old floorboards or the wind on the building. But it did not sound like that. It sounded intentional. Deliberate, slow footsteps, moving just beyond the edge around the corner. I took a deep breath and got up and looked around the shelving unit. Nothing. Nobody there. I breathed out, reminding myself again that it was nothing. Maybe a rat, or the wind finally. But the footsteps came back, nearer this time, just beyond the frozen foods, my heart racing. I froze for an instant, trying to decide what to do, call the police? But what to say? That I heard footsteps with no one around? That I was losing it? Instead, I headed in the direction of the sound. My boots echoed through the deserted store as I made my way down the aisle. The cold of the open cooler units blew past me. Nothing. I reached the end of the aisle and saw bare shelves only. No one around. No footprints, no dropped items, no disturbance. I lingered there for a long time, burdened by the silence. The store had taken something whole and held it just beyond reach. When I returned to the counter, I noticed that the front door was locked, as always. The alarm system was on standby. No one could have slipped in unnoticed. That night, I mentioned nothing to anyone about the footsteps or the dancing silhouette on the screens. I didn't want to be branded as paranoid or worse, dismissed as a fusspot over nothing. But subsequent nights witnessed the same. The footsteps. The sudden, inexplicable activity on the screens. The feeling of being watched, even in the most isolated moments. Early one morning, while the first pale light seeped into the room through the rain-streaked and dimmed windows, I was sweeping the floor near the rear entrance. I noticed the faint imprint of something written on the glass, a handprint, smudged and half-formed. I was certain that no one had approached the door all night. The security log showed no entry. I cleaned it off, but the image lingered in my mind like a quiet warning. Weeks passed, and the feeling of foreboding grew heavier and heavier. I feared the night shift, not for the work, but for the oppressive quiet that seemed to suffocate me. One night I sat on a stool at the back of the counter, my eyes heavy with fatigue. The rain was hammering harder now, drumming steadily on the roof and windows. I closed my eyes for a moment. Just a quick rest. When I opened them, the shop was no longer empty. Standing beside the frozen food stand was a presence, barely visible in the dimness. Not human, not shadow, simply there, looking at me. I couldn't move. My voice caught in my throat. I wanted to blink and make it disappear, but the presence remained. It did not move, did not blink, did not say anything. It simply watched. Rain pattered at the windows outside, and it seemed to grow quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath in tandem with me. Time passed, but I couldn't say for sure. Finally, the silhouette vanished, dissolving into the darkness like fog. I quit the work after that evening. I told my supervisor that I was leaving, needing something less alone. The encounter stayed with me, however, long after I'd left the convenience store behind. I catch myself thinking about those nights, about the silence that wasn't ever silence, about the footsteps that never had a source, about the presence that watched but never spoke. And sometimes, when rain beats quietly against my panes and the world dissolves into that same stillness I knew, I feel it again, the weight of unseen gazes, the unspoken presence that broods just beyond the edge of awareness. Some things are not to be explained, but to be remembered. I didn't explain to anyone why I really left. How could I? People tend to rationalize away, explain away, things that don't fit neatly into their universe. And for a bit, I tried to do the same. I had talked myself into believing it was all in my head, the result of round-the-clock solitary hours and too little sleep. But part of me, that quiet part which always comes alive in the late-night hours just before bed, knew better. After I got out, I tried to restart a normal life. I obtained a day job at a hardware store and started sleeping at night like everyone else. I assumed that being in the daylight again would reboot me, put me back on course. It didn't. Initially, I put it down to habit. I would continue to wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, as though some part of me were still on the old routine. But then I began to feel it again, that same creeping awareness that I wasn't alone. Not in the same manner as before, but close enough, close. There were those nights when I woke up and sat very quietly, the room quiet and dark, my ears straining to hear something just out of reach. A presence, a small one, but one you could not ignore, like a hand on the back of my neck. Never boisterous, never gaudy. Just a sensation, an intimacy. A few weeks afterward, I started dreaming about it again. Not the shop exactly, but the feeling. In the dreams, I was standing behind the counter, gazing at the screens, and on every screen, there would be the figure. Stopped. Still. Waiting. I'd wake up drenched with sweat, sitting there staring at shadows on my wall and questioning whether I'd ever really left it all. Worst of it wasn't the terror. It was the familiarity. I thought that night I'd drive past the store. Just once. Just one time, I vowed. To look again, to remind myself it was just a building, nothing more. I got to the lot at 1:30 a.m. The rain had started up again, slow, steady, sheeting down in mist. The store looked the same, the neon sign blinking over the entrance, a single dim bulb humming above the door. I idled across the street, headlights off, sat there just observing. It was quiet, no patrons, no cars, just the sound of raindrops on the windshield and the rumble of distant traffic. And then, as I was about to pack up and go home, I saw something. In the corner of the shop, past the final aisle, a light flickered to life. For a moment, the overhead fluorescent buzzed into action, casting a pale light over the shelves. And in that moment of illumination, unmistakably, was the presence of someone waiting there. Quiet, watching, I stood there for what felt like minutes, thudding heart in chest, waiting for the shadow to stir, to vanish, to shift or melt like it had before. It didn't. It just stood there, half lit in the fading light, as though expecting me to come back inside. I turned the key, put it in gear, and took off without looking over my shoulder. That was over a year ago. I have never walked into that part of town since then, and yet, periodically, I get it again, especially when it rains. That feeling of being watched. Not anything sinister, really, but something persistent, something patient. I started keeping the blinds shut at night. I changed flats. I changed habits, picked up hobbies, left lights on longer than I ought to. But none of it really makes a difference, because this feeling, this quiet, persistent feeling of being watched, it didn't stay in that shop. It trailed behind me. And sometimes now I'll hear those feet again. Not in a store, not on a monitor, but just past my bedroom threshold. Light, careful, measured. I never open up when I do. I don't even wince. I remain motionless and quiet, pretending to be asleep like a kid frightened by the darkness. because I know what that is that hovers on the other side. Not a phantom, not a man, something else, something that thrives in the spaces we vacate, something that haunts in the quiet, watching. I don't believe it ever wanted to hurt me. If it did, it's had thousands of years. But I believe it wanted something different, to be noticed, to be remembered. And I think it did. And now, however many years pass, however far I travel, however beautiful the world around, that feeling does not truly disappear. It lies in wait with the rain, in silence, behind the door. Years have passed since I last spoke about what took place in the first few months of lockdown and COVID-19. Looking back, maybe talking about it earlier would have been some sense to what I was going through, but then I knew nobody would believe me. Even today, as I try to describe it, there are times when I doubt my own memory, whether it was just the side effects of weeks of isolation or something much more nefarious. It started in the spring of 2020, when the world came to a sudden stop. I was alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of a rural town in Pennsylvania. I had always liked to be alone, even before it was imposed. The quiet brought a sense of order, of tranquility. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and that tranquility altered. It wasn't the quiet itself, but the kind of quiet that comes to feel watched. As with everyone else, I managed to get through the new world. I did work from home, stayed on a schedule, read books more than ever, and took long walks around the neighborhood. There were no other humans on the streets, and even the birds seemed quieter than they would normally be. For a time, I believed that it was the world holding its breath, stopping. But something wasn't quite right in the air. The air grew denser, the shadows in the hall longer, and the nights lasted forever. I recall the very moment I first felt it. It was the end of April. I was in the middle of a video conference with a coworker when my internet connection abruptly went out. That wasn't out of the ordinary. We'd all become accustomed to technical breaks, but what was out of the ordinary was the sound that followed. And I sat in the quiet of my apartment. Low tapping commenced. Not loud, not rhythmic, just soft, intermittent tapping, as in fingernails lightly scraping across wood. It was in the closet in the hall. I remained still, waiting. There were no vents or pipes there that would have been able to produce the sound. I attempted to justify it. Maybe something fell inside. Maybe it was the building settling. But by the time I arrived at the closet, the sound ceased. As I opened the door, it stood empty. There were only jackets, boots, and the smell of cedar. Nothing out of place. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been there was something. Or perhaps still was. I left on the hallway light the first night. It progressed over the next few days. It would be on the ceiling, sometimes on the baseboards, always light, always fleeting. Never long enough to be worth calling a human being. I was not going to call imaginary tapping into my landlord. Worse was becoming more attuned to not being alone. I found myself feeling small variations in the apartment. Things were not where they were before. My keys would be on the kitchen counter, rather than hanging on the hook near the door. One of my books would have been placed face down and would be upright. I had once discovered my bathroom mirror steamed up, such as after a hot shower had been taken, but I hadn't showered that morning. I attempted to reassure myself that it was forgetfulness. Lockdown was derailing everyone's perception of time and routine, but something deeper within me, a quieter voice, insisted otherwise. And the dreams. They never seemed graphic or grotesque. They were actually quite ordinary. I dreamed that I was in my apartment, standing next to the front door, waiting for someone to emerge. I never really had a chance to ascertain what was behind it. I would just simply stand there in the dream, frozen, heart racing, stiff. Every morning upon waking, I found myself waking up facing the direction of the door in life. as if during sleep my body had rolled over in that direction without my volition. The dreams began occurring every night, and with them a restlessness set in. I started sleeping less, pacing more, startling at every noise, actual or perceived. I was rummaging through boxes in my closet one evening in early May, searching for something, anything, to distract me. I came across an old Polaroid camera that I had almost forgotten. Spur of the moment, I snapped a few photos around the apartment. Something to do. I photographed the living room, the bedroom, the hallway, even the closet where the tapping had begun. When I went back and looked at the pictures afterwards, most of them were normal. But one, the corridor one, sent shivers down my spine. There was a shape. Not exactly a figure so much as a silhouette darker than the others, tall and thin, in the corner towards the ceiling. I gazed at the photograph for hours. I attempted to redo the photograph, believing that it was an optical illusion, but I was never able to replicate the same shadow. I began to hear breathing from that point forward. It was soft, barely audible, like a sleeper in the hallway. I was by myself, though. No one else was there. The breathing was always from the blackest part of the room, whichever room I was in. When I walked, it moved. When I sat, it sounded closer. I never saw anything, but I felt it, a heaviness, a stillness. I ceased entering the hallway at night. I stayed away from mirrors. I left all of the lights on, even though the electricity bill was beginning to rise. I didn't care. I woke one morning to find the front door open. I had closed it. I always did. My keys were on the floor by the doormat as if I had carelessly thrown them in. I sat there for quite a while, staring at the open door, wondering if perhaps I had gone mad at last. I told myself to call someone, a therapist, a friend, whoever, but I didn't. I couldn't explain everything in a manner that would not sound as if I were sick. The world was already crumbling. I did not want to be perceived as being too. By the end of May, the mood in my apartment had changed completely. It wasn't spooky anymore. It was off. The air crackled with static, like the start of a thunderstorm. My nightmares intensified. I no longer saw the door. I saw the corner of the hallway. Always dark, always just out of sight. And then something shifted. One evening, I woke up to the sound I couldn't help but hear. Footsteps. Light, measured, slow across the hardwood floor. From the hallway into the kitchen, pausing, then towards my bedroom. I lay in bed wide awake, too scared to move. The footsteps halted right in front of my door. I couldn't see anything, and the hall light had blown. I don't know how long I stood there holding my breath, waiting. At some point, sleep must have gotten the better of me, although I don't recall closing my eyes. When I woke up, everything was as it had been earlier. The hall light was still on. No one was there, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't dreaming. I started getting ready to go leave the apartment, although I didn't have anywhere to go. I prepared one night's bag, put it near the front door, and reminded myself that I would be gone the following day. I needed to get out, needed others, needed something more than walls. It was then, curled up on the couch and listening to the rain beat against the window, that the lights just went out. Abruptly. The apartment went black, aside from the constant throb of the storm outside. And then I heard something. Not tapping, not breathing, not footsteps. It was a voice. Soft, whispery, almost a breath. I couldn't hear the words, but the voice was unmistakably human. It was down the hall, low and slow, as if the person was speaking to themselves. I didn't move. I didn't even blink an eyelid. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, until the lights came on again. The hall was empty. That was the last thing. I moved out and moved in with a cousin in another few towns the next morning and stayed with her. I did not tell her everything. I simply explained that I needed to take a break. She was considerate enough not to probe. Later, the lockdown was removed. I moved into a new flat, nearer the city, more modern, more vibrant. I never returned to collect the rest of my belongings. The landlord sent me a box of some of them and a letter stating the apartment had been okay. although one of the maintenance men refused to enter the hall after he said he heard odd noises. Until that time, I couldn't very well comprehend what occurred. Perhaps it was the solitude, or perhaps whatever in that apartment didn't particularly enjoy being alone either. Whatever it was, it taught me that silence, pure silence, is a presence of its own. And on occasion, when the world hushes, something else sits down to listen. But that isn't all there is. In the months following my departure, I started to feel like myself once more. I went back to work. I rebuilt my relationships, and I even convinced myself that whatever had occurred was in the past, forgotten in the peculiarity of those early pandemic months. Until the other night in my new apartment, I found the old Polaroid camera at the bottom of a drawer. I hadn't thought of it since I moved out of the old apartment 6 weeks ago. Curiosity got the better of me. I snapped a photo of my new living room, just to see if the camera worked. The picture came out slowly, and when objects and lines started to take shape on it, I was frozen. There it was, the same form, tall and thin, jammed into the corner of the room. It hadn't remained behind. It had trailed me. And ever since that day, I've never been able to take a picture of a room without snapping it. Always in the corner. Always static. It doesn't move. Not on the pictures, at least. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I sense it near. The gentle brushing against the wall. The change in air pressure when the room is supposed to be quiet. And in dreams, the nightmares recur. Not of corridors. Not of doors. Now I have dreams about corners. Always dark. Always looking. I don't know what. I don't think I ever will. But I do know this. Whatever came into my life during those long, wordless months never departed. It was never about the apartment. It was about the quiet, the stillness. And it remains here, waiting, listening. It's been 10 years or more since the night in the woods, but I still find myself thinking about it more than I care to admit. I've attempted to justify it, attributing it to sleeplessness, loneliness, even the weather. But no matter how I explain it, some part of that evening won't let go. It sticks with me. The quiet, the air, the angle of the trees leaning in just a bit too far. None of it was right. I suppose I should start by confessing that I have always been solitary. Not antisocial, you understand. I've had coworkers, girlfriends, boyfriends, friends. But I've always needed to have my space. Time alone, away from humans, away from sound. Time to think. That's what drove me to solo camping in the first place. Out there in the quiet, I could finally breathe. That was when I was 30. I was working as an insurance analyst then. Numbers, deadlines, cubicles. They all started to blend together. I wasn't sleeping and was feeling myself begin to slip into numbness. I needed to escape. Something peaceful, grounding. Therefore, I took time off for a week, filled my truck with gear, and headed toward an underused tract of Pacific Northwest National Forest. I'd come across it on a hiker's bulletin board. Nothing organized, just 2 or 3 postings about a series of trails spurting off of a Forest Service road. No signs off the beaten path. Exactly what I was hoping to find. The drive-in was long and winding, blacktop giving over to gravel and then dirt. Trees became heavier as I traveled, swallowing up cell service and eventually, even the every now and then highway marker. Late afternoon, by the time I drove into a wide open space large enough to turn in, the trees that surrounded it were heavy with evergreens whose branches hung, weighted with years. Pine scent and wet dirt permeated the air, and there was a stillness in the air that I had not realized I was missing. I dug into my pack, locked up the car, and walked east into the woods. The trail was vague, almost erased by decades of weeds and dropped pine needles. But I continued on, relying on the map I had downloaded and my own internal compass. I hiked for about 2 hours before choosing a spot to camp. It was a bit hollow between two ridges, flat enough for a tent and close enough to a tiny creek that I could access water. There were no signs of other campers, no fire circles, no prints, nothing disturbed. It looked like the first person to walk there in decades was me. That first night passed quietly. I cooked dinner on my camp stove, listened to the gentle buzz of insects, and slept to the wind whispering through the canopy. It was the kind of peacefulness I'd been craving. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods with a day pack. No specific destination, just walking. I saw some strange things. A deer skull resting in the crotch of a tree, considerably higher than it should have been. Scratches on a rock, too large to be produced by a bear. I assured myself they were the remnants of past storms or the actions of other hikers' jokes. Nothing unusual. That night, however, things changed. It was subtle. At first, just the silence, no wind, no insects, no birds. It was the sort of quiet that rang in your ears. I remember waking up around midnight having no idea what had disturbed me. My tent was silent, air thick and motionless. I lay there for a long while, holding my breath, listening intently for even the faintest whisper of life outside. And then I heard it, a soft rustling. Not the breeze, something more intentional, conscious. It swept past my tent, not touching it but close enough that I could hear the pine needles being displaced beneath it. I didn't move. I just remained there, holding my breath. Whatever it was, it never stopped walking. The sound faded away slowly, as if it had simply continued straight into the woods. I talked myself into it being an animal, maybe a deer or elk. However, I did not sleep that night. The next morning I found tracks. Not paw prints, not hooves, but prints, like a human's. Bare. Human-shaped, but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too flat, and they were fresh prints in the wet earth, leading straight from the top of the ridge past my tent and into the underbrush on the other side. I considered packing up and leaving. I did. But there was something about the woods, the way they radiated in the light of morning, golden and soft, calming me. Maybe I was seeing things. I had been alone for 2 days after all. It could have been a print that had been warped by the rain. That is what I convinced myself, at least. I kept a fire going later that evening than I ever would. I didn't want to be left in the dark. I sat for hours, watching the flickering flames, sipping from a flask I'd brought to help me sleep. The forest around me was still, practically lethally so. I recall something odd happening at some stage. The light of the fire did not seem to reach as far as it normally would. At the edge of the ring of light, the trees seemed darker than they had the night before, more deeply in a sense, as if they were recoiling from the light, and the sounds, whispers, soft, passing. So faint I couldn't select one word, but distinct enough to recognize they weren't in my mind. They would swell and recede, like a breeze in tall grass. But there was no breeze. Just those soft voices making the rounds outside my camp. I screamed out. I have no idea what I screamed. Something indistinct. Hello? Maybe. The whispers stopped immediately. And in their place, laughter. Low and raspy. Not loud. Just enough to put the hairs on the back of my neck on end. I didn't sleep that night. By the next morning I had decided that I was leaving. I set out hastily, hardly ate anything, and returned the way that I came. But something was amiss. The trail vanished. I stood for a very long time at what had been the main path back to the clearing. I recognized the stream, the bend in the ridgeline, but the soft trail, what little there had been left of it, was vanished. Not overgrown, not camouflaged, just lost. I roamed for hours in increasing radii, taping trees orange with markers from my backpack. But everything was in the wrong direction. The woods weren't the woods that I'd gone into. They were too silent, too symmetrical, as if I went around a circle. Eventually I found something that turned my stomach. A campsite, not my own. Older, tattered clothes, rusty gear, discarded personal items. No sign of anyone. No sign of animals either, just decay. And in the center of it all, standing upright and intact, a metal canteen, still upright, as if the person who had left it there had merely set it down. I retreated. Whatever had happened here, I had no part in it. I set up my tent that night without a fire. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just rested there, listening. The whispers returned again, but this time, they were closer, no longer hovering. They were behind the tent, right at the edge of the fabric. I could hear breathing, slow, labored. I could feel something outside standing just beyond the nylon wall, waiting, and then, quite softly, something brushed against the tent. Not clawed, not menacing, just the lightest possible brush of fingers on the material, from end to end. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body wouldn't cooperate. The sounds eventually ceased, but the feeling remained, that pressure in the air, being watched behind glass. I stayed inside the tent until morning. When I finally emerged, the world looked as it was, normal even. Birds had returned, trees were swayed by the wind, but something deep within me knew the forest had not let me go. Not yet. I shuffled aimlessly all day, dragging my feet and not really concerned with direction. I was dry, shaking. The phone map, not that it mattered because I was without signal, showed a compass. I traveled west by its guidance, in hopes of intersecting the road, in hopes of catching sight of something recognizable, and miraculously late in the day I did. The clearing, my car, right where I'd left it untouched with a good coat of pine dust. I didn't stop to think. I got in, put in the key, and drove down the road until I hit pavement. I drove on for hours, until I came to a town with lights and souls and sounds. I didn't tell anyone anything about what occurred, not for a long time at all. Who would believe me? That the woods had reorganized themselves around me? That something out there had followed me without ever appearing? But I know what I experienced. I know what I felt. And I know in my belly that whatever it was, it wasn't finished. Occasionally, when I am in bed at night, I can hear the whispers. Barely, as if they never really left. And sometimes, on the rare nights when I sleep with my window open, I could have sworn I could still smell pine. I wish I could say that arriving home put everything to rest. It didn't. In the following days, I tried to fall back into my routine, heading to work, answering emails, heating up frozen meals in my apartment, but everything felt distant, as if watching someone else's life through a window. I stopped sleeping. Not necessarily because I was scared, really, but because I couldn't appear to settle. The silence in my apartment, once comforting, now felt stifling. Waiting. It was as if the silence I had gone in search of in the woods had followed me home. I'd wake up during the night and imagine that someone had just left the room. The hallway would have a subtle smell of sap and soil. I'd pick up on it a few times, dirt beneath the windowsill, as if someone, or something, had been out there observing. I figured it was all in my head. Stress, sleep deprivation. Then came the dreams. They weren't nightmares exactly, just endless curved walks in endless trees. I was always searching for something, but I never knew what. And the forest in the dreams, it wasn't the one I'd camped in. It was older, silent, as if the trees were all holding their breath. Sometimes in the dream, I'd see flickers of movement between the trunks. Shapes that almost looked human. Too tall, limbs slightly too long. They never moved directly, always just out of view. Watching. I began waking up exhausted, like I'd been walking in the dark. My feet would ache, my calves would ache. And once I awoke with pine needles on my bed sheets. No why, no how they got there. That's when I knew something had followed behind me. I started to go through it. Not in news sites or discussion boards, nothing like that. I looked for older stuff, library databases, field reports, the kind of writing that people do when they don't care if people believe them, only that the truth is on paper. And I found things. Pieces, really. Stories of hikers vanishing in forests with no signs of trails, whispers in areas where no animals are visible, campsites discovered with all gear left behind, fires still lit, stories dating decades ago, some even more, told word of mouth by local tribes, most of which would not speak of the inner parts of the forests at all. They all spoke of the same idea. There are parts of the world that do not want to be watched, parts that bide their time. And when someone trips into them by accident or on purpose, something stirs up. I'd wandered into one of those parts, and now, even after I'd escaped, I wasn't certain that it had released me. Lastly, I resigned. I ceased answering calls. I moved thousands of miles away, expecting distance to sever whatever thread remained tethered to that place. For a while it worked. The nightmares faded. The smell of pine no longer clung to the hallway. I almost managed to convince myself that it had been a combination of isolation, stress, and an overactive mind. Almost. There was a letter last month. No return name. Plain envelope stamped from some town in the Pacific Northwest that I did not recognize. A single photo inside. It was a forest. Nothing unusual at first glance. Tall trees, filtered light, a dirt road that snaked through the undergrowth. But I recognized it at once. It was the clearing where I'd left my car. The same angle I'd looked from the last day. Only, in the photo, my car wasn't present. And in the back of the line of trees, half hidden from the light, was the outline of something standing upright, watching the camera. I didn't say anything. What could I say? That something hunted me down again? That it can locate where I am? I burned the photo, but it did no good. Because last night I heard them again, the whispers, not violent, not loud, just enough to make me know. They remember. I don't know what they are. Spirits, things, something before language. I don't think they want to hurt me. Not on purpose, but I think once you've seen them, once they've known you've entered their silence, they do not forget you, and they don't forget you. So now I live in silence. No more camping, no more hiking. I keep my windows closed, my lights on. I avoid quiet when I can. I drown out my apartment with sound, fans, white noise, even rain sounds on continuous repeat, because the quiet is where they hide. They're patient. And when the world is quiet enough, they somehow manage to get in. So if you ever camp alone, if you ever are on a trail that seems just a little too quiet, a little too nice, turn back. Because some places remember, and some silences don't like to be disturbed.